Good afternoon, everyone. I see everyone's trickling in. I'll just give it maybe another 10, 15 seconds before we get started here. But thank you for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. This is NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovations webinar series. This webinar is entitled Black Start Considerations in a Highly Renewable Supply Future. If we could move to the next slide, please. Just a quick background. NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1889. Our members are state utility regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and US territories. FERC and FCC commissioners are also members, and we have associate members in 20 other countries. NARUC member agencies regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. Next slide, please. About NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovations, we encourage everybody to check us out online. We are a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members, and we look at emerging challenges and connect state commissioners with expertise and strategies to help inform their decision-making. And in that role, we're excited that we have a great panel of experts here. If you could move to the next slide, and I will turn things over to our gracious moderator, Chair Gladys Brown-Dutrell of the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. Chair, please go ahead.
Thank you, Will, and good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to see that there are a lot of people that are interested in our topic for today, which is the Black Start in a highly renewable supply future. And you know, as a country and as the world in general, we're talking about a lot of different events, whether it's weather events, cybersecurity definitely is the top of our thoughts today, as well as physical security and disruptions within the utility services. So our panel today is going to explore how the Black Start restoration model will change when supply is increasingly generated via renewable assets or distributed energy resources as well. We have a great panel lined up for today, and I want to take a moment to introduce them. Our first panelist is Dr. Paul Stockton. He is the chair of DOE's Advisory Subcommittee on Grid Resilience for National Security and a senior fellow with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Our second panelist is Gab Susau, a senior engineer, Power Systems Engineering Center at NARA, which is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And our third panelist today is Mike Bryson, who is a Senior Vice President of Operations with PJM Interconnection. So I have given each of the panelists flexibility to go 12 to 15 minutes to talk about this topic, and they're going to go in the order that I have introduced them. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stockton first. Thank you.
Dr. Stockton, I believe you're muted.
You'd think I'd figure this out at some point. Chair Dutrell, thank you very much for the opportunity to support you and NARUC and support all the other folks on the call today on such an important topic. I'd like to start out by providing a baseline assessment of what Black Start requires and why it's so important in the emerging security environment, especially today, where the risk of great power conflict is once again a front and center. And we may be facing risks in the future, a very wide area blackouts where Black Start power restoration is going to be essential. Next slide, please. As always, let me tell you what I think the most important takeaways are from my little presentation. We need Black Start power capabilities because, again, of the risk of very wide area outages, where the need to accelerate the restoration of service to critical defense facilities, hospitals, water systems is going to be paramount. And Black Start can help do that if Black Start can stay resilient as we transition to a situation where we rely heavily on wind and solar, what I'm going to call today variable renewable generation. There's lots of things that we can do, and we'll talk about them today, to make sure that we can maintain that resilience, but we need to plan for it as opposed to hoping that a magic fairy is going to come and sprinkle dust over the Black Start system. Not going to happen. So now is the time for state regulators and all other stakeholders in resilient power systems to begin thinking about how is Black Start going to function in a VRE heavy system. Next slide, please. I want to provide a level set here of what constitutes a Black Start. Now, typically, almost all past major US power outages, we've restored power by taking power from the outside of the blacked out area, where the grid is still up and running, where generators haven't tripped off due to the outage, and we bring that power from the outside into the blacked out region in order to restart generators, serve critical load, bring the grid back up and running in the outage area. Black Start is the opposite. Instead of importing power from the periphery of the outage area, you do it from inside the blacked out region. And of course, that's the huge advantage of Black Start, isn't it, in a wide area power outage? Because if you can restart from the center of a very wide area power outage, potentially an entire interconnection, you're going to be able, in theory, to get power, grid-provided power, back to critical loads much more quickly than might otherwise be possible with traditional approaches to outside-in power restoration. So again, thinking about how in a VRE-heavy system we're going to be able to do Black Start is essential because it's so important for national security. Next slide, please. There are three phases of Black Start that I want to walk us through. And of course, later on, my colleagues on the panel are going to talk about these phases in greater detail in the context of a VRE heavy grid. First of all, the transmission operator who's responsible for Black Start plans and capabilities starts up the restoration process with what's called a Black Start resource, often a small diesel powered generation. There are other options to get the restoration process going with battery. The key here is that Black Start resource doesn't need any external power to get going, doesn't need the grid to support it. It can start on its own when an operator presses a button. Once that Black Start resource is energized, we take that power and we send it down what's called the cranking path. That is an isolated transmission corridor that's connected to special Black Start generators along the cranking path. You use that additional power from the Black Start resource to start up the next generator along the cranking path. Then with that additional power, you start the next one and so on down the cranking path. And as you add generation capacity, obviously you also need to pick up load to keep the system in balance, because as you all know, grid stability requires constant balance and close to perfect balance between a generation and load. And so in this process of initial Black Start establishment of a cranking path, you create a little power island within the larger blacked out region. Next slide. And once you've established that power island, you're going to want to grow it, aren't you? You're going to want to add additional generation capacity from larger generators. You're going to pick up additional load, and that's absolutely vital because there are a lot of folks not on the initial cranking path who need service right away. And this process of growing the power island enables that load pickup to happen. It also has the advantage, of course, of making power islands more stable because you got more generation, you got more load. So if something trips off, well, you can recover from that more easily. And then, of course, ultimately, what you'd like to do is grow that power island so much and synchronize it with neighboring power islands so that you can restore the entire interconnection. And that synchronization is very important. PJM and other reliability coordinators are expert at performing that latter function, as well as everything else that I've been talking about thus far. But the question of how to do it in a VRE heavy system, of course, is the question. Next slide, please. So let's walk through each of those phases and talk about what VRE penetration is going to mean. Phase one, starting up that initial black start resource, I'm not worried about that. There are plenty of alternatives to using diesel generators, other fossil fuel sources for that initial black start. Plenty of good ideas to use VREs combined with batteries. That second phase, though, energizing the cranking path and establishing the initial power island, we're in deep trouble because most transmission operators rely almost exclusively on gas-fired generators, gas fuel generators, in order to add generation capacity along that cranking path and pick up load. This is a gas-heavy system, folks, that we've got right now for power generation. And there's some reasons because gas is, as long as the fuel is flowing, gas generators are always going to be there when you need it. If the sun isn't shining, if the wind doesn't blow, gas-fired generators don't care. You can dispatch them. You can control them pretty well in terms of voltage and frequency. We're good at that. Again, problems for gas and electric, unless you have, gas for wind and solar, although power electronics, as we'll hear, can help with that. We're going to need new zero carbon technologies in order to make sure that the characteristics that gas fuel generators on the cranking path provide can be replicated going forward. And that's going to be a challenge. Next slide, please. And then phase three, growing and integrating power islands. Again, we've got big problems here because most of the generators that are going to be used to grow those power islands, again, they're fueled by natural gas. And you can synchronize power islands pretty well if you can control those generators that are fueled by natural gas. Replicating that synchronization with VREs is going to be much more difficult. And of course, my last point is you can use power electronics in order to try to replicate the characteristics of gas fuel generators that makes them so valuable for black start. But as you add more power electronics, as you do fancy things to replicate the beneficial characteristics of natural gas-fired generators, you may be creating new vulnerabilities for adversaries to attack us. And because they know we depend on black start in severe outages, you can bet they'll prioritize attacks, preparations for attacks on black start capabilities going forward. So thank you for letting me provide a brief introduction to what constitutes black start, the three phases of black start, and what it's going to take to transition resilient black start to a VRE heavy system. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Gabsu Sao, who's going to be next. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
I cannot open the camera. Seems like I'm not allowed to. All right. Thank you, Will. All right. Hello, everybody. As introduced, this is Kapsu from National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Golden, Colorado. Thank you for the introduction, Gladys, and the NARA team for inviting me to this webinar. Happy to be here. I think it's very timely, and after Dr. Stockton pointed out wonderful points, also covering some aspects from the technological standpoint. I want to talk about the black start from inverter-based resources or the variable renewable energies as Paul used, or distributed energy resources, mainly solar, wind turbine, or the storage devices from a technological standpoint. Let us get started. Next slide, please. So the first off, let us understand what is the motivation quickly, as I see that the main motivation is the skyrocketing level of renewable energy resources across the globe, mainly because they are competitive now. It is a good thing. You may have heard the levelized cost of energy, a metric to evaluate how much cost needed per energy kilowatt hour for electricity, for example, for generation. And the LCOE for PV and wind is now comparable or even cheaper in certain areas. So renewable energy deployment is no longer incentive driven, but more market driven now. And therefore, we will see the exceptional changes ahead in the grid, their portion of the generation. It is a good thing in terms of decarbonization as everybody concerned. However, certainly we are already seeing a lot of issues and concerns as well in a high penetration grid area like California or New York. And mainly because the foundation of the new technology is different. Black start is one of them, since the conventional generators or synchronous generators have been the black start resources for many decades, and that will be replaced by inverter-based resources. So the second point is resilience. So as hinted by Dr. Stockton as well, it is a big keyword nowadays regarding making the power system more resilient against natural disasters happening more and more. People talk about some positive views, like we may be able to improve the resilience since the renewables are, in general, our power sources more local, closer to the consumers. So what if we restore the system from the local assets and continue providing the electricity to consumers, even under bulk power system is still blackout? So based on those backgrounds, we see increasing interest from industry partners questioning about the technological feasibility of the inverter-driven black start, since there are lots of unknowns. So we need to research. Next slide, please. So this slide is to give audience a little bit of background to understand the fundamental differences between the machine and the inverters. As you can see, they are very different in many aspects. First of all, inverter-based resources or IBRs are not fully controllable in terms of prime power source. For example, solar power is not available in the middle of the night, right? And since inverters are electronics, their dynamic is way faster than machine. Inverters do not have large inertia simply because they do not have rotating mass, and that is existing synchronous machines, and the inertia is providing certain rules, big rules, such as slowing down the frequency variations and so on. So it's a big thing. And the short circuit capability is another big one. Inverters, essentially they are electronics, right? Are designed to cover only like 10% or no more than 20% overhead. So that's a big controversy point. And regarding the scale in general, it is common to see gigawatt level synchronous generators, but inverters are scaled usually kilowatt or just up to a few megawatts level. And essentially because they are geographically limited. So essentially, even though you see some very big PV-based generations, for example, they are kind of a group of many small inverters. So machine behavior is lastly well understood. The grid has existed more than a century, but inverters are relatively new. So they have been considered rather than the main contributor to the grid maintenance, but they have been considered as a negative load, so like a passive, and they need to comply with the regulations very similar to the loads, like a THD regulation. So grid forming inverter concept to change the paradigm is emerging. So now we see the inverters as main player for the grid services, but there is a lot to do, a lot to be understood for wide application of the new concept. Next slide, please. So now, with the understanding of technological differences in mind, we can see the technical challenges in inverter black start. First off, we may not have one single IBR or inverter-based black start resource in a near future, which we can simply pick and replace the conventional black start resource due to the scale. So therefore, we may need multiple IBRs work together to make a black start, probably combined with storages. So definitely it may increase complexity, right? And challenges and opportunities go both ways due to the marginal short circuit capability, in-rush or cold load pickup management will be critical. On the other hand, sophisticated control would ease the complex process, including soft to start capability for the big power system, utilizing the computation power of the inverters. In addition, there is no industry practice or protocol in place yet, so meaning that we are in a very early stage for the paradigm shift. Research and development effort will play a critical role in bringing this reality. Next slide, please. So considering those challenges and promising aspects when we bring IBRs, or inverters, on the black start game plan, we can think of 4 potential use cases categorized in terms of location and number of inverters in the play. So first one is inverter-based Kickstarter, as you can see on the top left, to provide auxiliary power to start the big black start resource as illustrated. It is a relatively well-defined and viable solution for near future, not requiring significant challenges in the paradigm and in the black start planning. Second use case is at the bottom is the same Kickstarter, but only co-located, not co-located cases. So it is good as it can kickstart multiple generators if needed, and it may improve the resource utilization in normal operation as well. So it is a one step forward, but there will be more unknowns because the inverters has to cover post-fault conditions, maybe unseen before then. And from third one on the top right, we are going toward more futuristic solutions. So in case 3, now we have renewable plus storage unit as a black start unit and a full black start unit. It replaces traditional black start resources. As hinted earlier, operators may need to further sectionalize the grid, considering the size of the inverter black start units. The capability would be limited compared to the traditional ones. The inverter unit should have enough reserve, for example, store the energy in the battery to be able to fully black start the system. And it raises some questions about economical merit since it may limit the operation range of the storage unit. We need to keep the state of the charge, for example, reserved for the black start operation. And the storage is still very much expensive. And the last one goes further. So now we see multiple black start units located remotely each other, and they collectively black start the grid. So when successfully configured, they can cover a wide area with aggregated capacity, and they can achieve high flexibility because a grid no longer relies on a single black start resources. Any unit aggregated enough to black start can be utilized. So we have flexibility. It can be much more resilient as well from the same reason and give a lot of opportunities to improve further by using more intelligence and as well as autonomy. But we need a significant R&D effort to finally make it happen. Next slide, please. All right. So here I want to quickly introduce R&D activities around this. So first of all, we have a few Blackstar related projects at NREL. So as you can see, we are closely working with DOE labs and the industry as well as academia. And from near future concept, like a somewhat centralized level, utilizing communication infrastructure, or even communication free, or just from centralized coordination to decentralized coordination, utilizing the local computing power as well. And the distribution level bottom-up approach, like utilizing microgrid capability, and then they help us to bring up the bulk power system as well. Also, yeah, traditional transmission level, but having some more intelligence and flexibility. Also, definitely cybersecurity, and we are also considering like to make the Blackstar process super secure. We can consider the blockchain or new technologies to make it secure. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we have a lot of laboratory scale prototype up to megawatt scale test beds, so that we are making the technology more realistic. Next slide, please. So from this slide, maybe 3 slides, I want to introduce a new effort, Unified Consortium. So this is a DOE project with $25 million federal money plus $10 million cost share from industry partners. Under this biggest effort ever conceived in the grid forming inverter area, we are making a unified effort to drive the renewable-based power system sooner, hopefully sooner, with many collaborators, including utilities, inverter manufacturers, national labs, and academia across the country. So we have more than 50 partners involved already. And the Blackstar using inverters is one of the key deliverables in the project. So we are demonstrating 20 megawatt scale inverter-based system operation, including restoration aspect. So yeah, stay tuned. Next slide, please. So here is a little more details about Unify. So we are covering not only R&D, but also demonstration and commercialization, as you can see, as well as workforce development. So it is a 5-year project, but we plan to stay active beyond 5 years until we finally make things reality. Next slide, please. Yeah, I would like to conclude with a few points, takeaways. We will have anyway a lot more renewable-based generations in power systems very soon, and already stemming from their fundamental differences, inverters will bring challenges as well as opportunities in the entire area, including Blackstar. So lots of miles to go, but with proper arrangement and technology development, I believe we'll see a fully modernized grid. And with that, yeah, I'm very excited to witness all the innovations happening nowadays. Next slide, please. All right, that's all my from my side. Please do not hesitate to reach out. There's more information and contact. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will be happy to discuss more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Gab-Su. Our final panelist is Mike Bryson from PJM.
Good, thanks, Chair Dutrell, and thanks everybody for having me on this panel. It's a kind of a humbling panel to be on with Dr. Stockton and Gab-Su. So I just want to kind of build on what Dr. Stockton and Gab-Su talked about a little bit. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a little groundwork, which again, I think builds on what they said. You know, one of the things I think about when people talk about Blackstar is there's some kind of general misconceptions. And, you know, we worked with DOE and DOD a couple of years ago on the potential to look at more Blackstar resources because of DOD facilities. And one of the things I think in a lot of ways that really calls for backup generator, not Blackstar generator, meaning they're gonna need to be on immediately and run for prolonged periods of time. Not really what we're talking about. We also think about a lot of the the NARUC staff and commissioners are very familiar with storm restoration and priority of restoration. Again, really not what we're talking about here. We really focus on that third block there, system restoration. And Paul kind of built a foundation of what this is. It's using those black start resources. It tends to be large areas of the system. I know there's a comment in the Q&A that talks a little bit about, have we ever done a full black start of a region? I know we haven't done it in PJM, at least for the last 30 years. Haven't started a black start unit in anger. Haven't had to do it. We only test them. And one of the things too is, like in PJM, just by way of example, we have almost 160 different black start units across the system. And I would prefer to have one tie line with another system that's up and running than having to start any of those. So system restoration tends to be very big and very much about interconnection. And then we're not as much focused on this, but I think there's also this concept of black sky scenarios where you have prolonged periods of outages based on major infrastructure damage. A lot of independent islands out there. We may be talking about weeks and months of outages, and some of these units, and particularly some of the units that Gab-Su talked about, tend to be really potentially good resources during those kind of scenarios. Next slide. So one of the things, certainly I'm from PJM, but I think one of the things about black start and system restoration is it's really a standard core competency across all electric utilities in the US. In fact, I think of black start and system restoration being equivalent to the combat mission of utilities. It's something we train a lot on, it's something we prepare on, and it's something that we never have to do, and we rarely have to do it for real. It's an approach that's governed by NERC standards. The EOP 5 and EOP 6 standards go into a lot of detail about what utilities have to be able to maintain at the generation, the TOP, transmission operator, reliability coordinator, balancing authorities across the system. And it tends to generally be a bottom-up approach, meaning the plan is based on worst case scenario, which is you're not going to have outside help, you're going to have to go it alone. And so those plans are really based on that. Pretty standard across the NERC regions. Paul kind of walked through how the black start units, they help with nuclear safe shutdown. They kind of make sure that the electric compressors are on, and then they start cranking bigger units and pulling load together across the system. Next slide, please. So one of the things, and I'll just talk a little bit about a PJM approach, is the way we decide how much black start we need is it's really about, number one, getting power to bigger units on the system. And we define those units of any units that can start in 4 hours or less. So black start unit starts with no help, and it sets that cranking path to these bigger units that are 4 hours or less away, so we can get those up and running. We also use black start for nuclear safe shutdown power. And then also one of the critical things that we also do based on the 2011 Southeastern blackout and kind of reaffirmed last year is we also make sure we have enough black start to get power for critical gas infrastructure up and running as well. Our black start units have to be able to self-start and close to a dead bus, meaning no electricity coming in from the outside within 3 hours. And then they provide that power to critical loads. And that's kind of the way we do it now with very much traditional thermal units, as Paul talked about. But we also have a lot of hydroelectric power in the system, which is a really good, clean black start resource. It's just not available everywhere we potentially need it. Next slide, please. So, just kind of talking through the black start process, Paul touched on this, but it's really about bringing those black start units on across the system. Again, we will start from as many of the 150 black start units we have across the system and start connecting them to the cranking paths from those black start units out to critical load based on all of our individual utility restoration plans. One of the critical parts here is picking up pieces of load along the way that help balance the system. And Paul touched on this too. It's really critical that the whole time you're restoring the system that you balance the load and generation, because this is a part that if we get it wrong, we start all over again. And it's kind of a tricky thing. And it's just a lot of manual switching out in the field with a lot of utility crews. And then as you're going along the way too, the system control is very important. You got to make sure your system voltages, your frequency, they all need to be controlled to avoid tripping or damaging equipment that you're using to try to get up and running. And if you trip the restoration island in the process of doing it, and we've done this many times during drills, you have to start over again. You have to start that restoration process over. Next slide, please. So how do we decide black start units that we're going to use? So renewables versus thermal. Gabsu talked a lot about some of the differences between traditional thermal units. Hydro has a lot of those same characteristics, and renewables. What we use as an evaluation is we conduct technical feasibility. So we actually use an RFP process. We go out and ask people to give us their best technical solution to meet particular critical technical feasibility needs. So we'll do reliability analysis based on the NERC studies that are required, very much location based. You got to be pretty close to the next load that you're going to crank. And then we look at operational and environmental restrictions as well. Fuel assurance, I know there was a question in the chat about that. We prefer currently dual fuel with on-site preferred or hydro. We also have some cases where we have natural gas that have multiple pipelines or firm gas. And then we look at what are some of the operational restrictions, ramping, load following, the minimum operating level, how long those units can stay online. And are there permitting restrictions? Are they going to be able to build and operate that unit the way we need them to operate going forward? Next slide, please. Just again, a little bit, this builds on what Paul was talking about. You have the black start unit. And really what I want to kind of point out here is all the steps along the way that require manual switching from the black start unit to the next bus, to the line, to the substation, to the transformers along the way, to the substation and back to the next generation. All of those are manual steps that require certainly a lot of safety checks along the way. So again, multiple steps, and really failures along the way mean you go back to square one and try it again. In this particular case, it's a very simple model. You're talking about 2 substations, 4 lines, plus the transformers along the way. Next slide, please. I want to kind of illustrate something that Paul talked about a bit. The hypothetical case, you have this wide area here, and you have a couple different fuel assured black start units. Some are non-fuel assured. You got some critical load out there. I talked about those 4-hour units. You got some nuclear units out there. Go to the next slide. So really the aim is you want to be able to take those black start units and tie together to those next critical load units to start to hook the system together. And once you get these, in this particular case, these 5 small islands together, then you'll start hooking those together. And once you get an island big enough, the idea is you'll start connecting it to neighboring islands as well. So again, establishing islands is important. And connecting the islands with 1 or more tie lines is going to be important too. So when you start connecting these to other areas all along the way, making sure that you're providing for all of those characteristics, voltage and frequency, and also really being able to do it safely for the crews that are out there. Next slide, please. Gabsu really touched on a lot of this, which really is about, so what about intermittent resources? And we're certainly very much relying on organizations like NREL to be able to provide us some really good academic and practical use, because as we transition from a real thermal-based generation resource mix throughout the system, we also have to make sure that we have practically tested and used some of these technologies as we're replacing traditional black start units with other types of black start resources. Next slide, please. Kind of a couple points in summary. Again, current black start resources, typically oil and natural gas. We also have a lot of hydro. So how can renewable resources and storage technology really fill some of the gaps? I mentioned that we use RFPs to get replacement black start when we have a unit retire. We have actually had legitimate, technically feasible proposals that fall into the category that Gab-Su talked about, his number 1, number 2, and number 3 examples. And so all of them were technically feasible, so they passed the studies, but they were significantly more expensive than the alternatives that were there too, in the order of 4 to 10 times as much. And this is important, something we have to talk about going forward is, are we willing to pay those additional costs? The other thing too is when you think about storage as a resource for black start, that storage is going to be dedicated to the black start. So it's not going to have the opportunity necessarily to run for energy or other services out there. And really, when you think about during the process, even if they're not a black start resources, when will those renewable generators be allowed to come on and run and serve local load, either in islands, small islands, or microgrids and things like that? There's a lot of potential there. We are in the filing and implementation phase of FERC Order 2222. And that's important because adequate standards and enforcement for DER and what place that, where it fits into this, I think is really important. Number 4 is really near and dear to my heart. State renewable policies really need to allow for transition of reliability services such as black start. Gab-Su talked about some examples of promising technologies, but none of them are tried and true on a production grid. And we need to get them in place before we retire what's already there, or we're going to have portions of the system that are really going to have long restoration times if we ever do get into a blackout. We've evaluated some of these. We continue to use the research that's out there and encourage some pilots on our system will allow us to be able to do that. And again, renewable resources, as Gab-Su pointed out, really have the potential to provide black start in a hybrid configuration, partnering storage and renewables together. So with that, I'll kind of wrap it up and turn it back to Chair Dutrell.
Thank you very much, Mike, and also thank you to Gab-Su and Paul. We've have a lot of information that we received this afternoon, and with that, we also have several questions that popped up. Normally, I like to start off with some questions that I've had, but I think the questions are so important, and I want to make sure we're able to ask the questions that were put in the Q&A section. I don't know, Will, if you want me to read those or
sure. Why don't you go ahead and
Okay.
read those, and I'll jump in if any are missed.
Okay, great. So our first question is, what utility or grid has successfully completed a black start? And I know that was talked about in PJM's, Mike, when you were talking that you haven't had to do one. I don't want to explain how you were, I'd rather you explain it, but I believe I heard you say you have not had to do one. You've definitely done training, and I would like for you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure, yeah, and I suspect there might be some small grids across the United States that may have had to do this. I'm not familiar with them. Paul's nodding his head, so maybe he can help. But I know we, in the last 30 years, even during the 2003 blackout, we did not need to start black start units for that because we used tie lines for good areas of the system to help both internally and neighboring systems.
Paul, did you want to jump in on that question as well?
There's one instance that I think would fall in the category of black start, and that is the 1965 blackout, which I'm the only person here old enough to remember that. Thanks to hydro in upstate New York, the Niagara Falls related plants, they were able to establish a power island by restarting a generation that had been tripped off during the event, and they used hydro to establish fairly stable power island. So To me, that counts as black start. They weren't able to reestablish the Eastern interconnection, but hey, hydro is great if you have it. Upstate New York, Pacific Northwest, California, hydro is wonderful. It's zero carbon, but in many parts of the United States, of course, it ain't gonna happen because flat as a pancake, and we're gonna need the kinds of alternative inverter-based or VRE resources that Gab Sue talked about so eloquently. Thanks.
Thank you. And Gabsu, I don't want to leave you out. I wouldn't necessarily call upon you to answer that question, but I don't want to leave you out.
No, yeah, excellent answers, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question that's in the Q&A is, in addition to black start or supporting early stage restoration, even knowing when to bring wind and solar online during restoration is very important. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I did see that, so I cheated a little bit. I kind of touched on it in my comments, but yeah. And so if you think about this concept that Paul and I talked about, and even Gab Sue, where you start a black start unit and you start picking up load along the way, there may be opportunities at some point where you can call renewables and say, hey, we have enough load out on their system that we can support additional generators to come on. I know in PJM right now, that's a very manual process, largely because our renewable penetration in PJM is still relatively small compared to a lot of other areas of the system. So, even if it, in some cases, if it came on early, it probably wouldn't cause us too much problem, but it has the potential to cause issue if it comes on before it's ready. The beauty of it, I think, is because of the wind solar startup is they'll be able to start up very quickly and be able to support the system once we get enough of it put together.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Gab Sue?
I agree. I mean, the standardization would be critical because as of now, they are all just negative loads. Like we are seeing new standard or refined standard, including IEEE 1547, as well as P 2800. So that we are just started paving the way for allowing those variable renewable energy resources to support the restoration and as well as maintaining the normal conditions. Yeah, a lot of challenges and opportunities.
Okay, all right. Well, I like how you ended that, and opportunities.
Yeah.
Let me pick another question. What will be the impact of massive solar PV on the distribution system when the grid is being restored? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
So I'll kind of just take the first shot at that, and probably, I think Gab Sue kind of touched on it a little bit. Is it's one of the things that's important in a blackout, if you don't have a microgrid. So there are places out there where your solar and your wind and your storage support a microgrid, which means during a blackout, they can actually disconnect from the system and kind of start on their own. And at some point in the future, they just can reconnect. Princeton University is a good example that has a microgrid there. I think the Navy Yard down in Philadelphia has a microgrid. There's a lot of them. So they have the ability for that behind the meter solar to be able to do that. But having said that, in a situation where we're in a blacked out situation, one of the first things, you kind of learn even in a power outage, you got to turn everything off first before you start to energize, or you run into safety issues. And so the solar being off is really important until there's enough stability and load for it to be able to support coming on again.
Thank you. Gab Sue?
Yeah, totally agree. Without proper coordination, like anti-islanding is super important as of now. Like we should have a standardized operation that can be understood all across the whole power system, including transmission level as well as the distribution level, so that with that we can carefully initiate the black start process. Without that, if they accidentally just involved, then they may destabilize the whole system. That's not thing we really want. We want them to be more supportive and successfully complete the black start process. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I know, Paul, you did have your mic off.
Yeah, I think
So
there's a
jump
bigger
in there.
There's a bigger problem here, and that is that there are all kinds of now distribution management systems that are standing up, increasingly automated, but the visibility sometimes of bulk power system entities and transmission operators, above all, who are going to be managing black start, their visibility over distribution level assets that are going to present safety issues and balancing issues. This is a big frontier where I'm hoping NREL and its many partners will be able to make progress, because it's a problem, and not only for black start.
Okay. I love when Paul gives an answer because it's definitely a challenge. All right, we still have a couple other questions. I am so excited about the fact that people are really engaged. So I'm going to go back to, I think it's Vicus, but the question is, existing black start resources are strategically placed near critical loads. Wind, for example, are usually in remote areas. To use them as black start resource, will it not also depend on available transmission network for deliverability of power to those critical loads as soon as possible? So I see Paul nodding his head. I don't know if you want to jump in first or let Mike.
Mike, because he lives this challenge all the time.
There you go, Mike.
Yeah, I think the question was really well worded, and I almost say he answered the question in the question, but that siting is really important because you really don't want to have large transmission distances between the startup generation and the critical load. At some point, you're going to have to do some of the longer term, but you really need to get a lot of stable islands out there before you do that. So that will certainly be one of the challenges for both solar and wind. Is it has to be an ideal geographic area for that resource, and it has to be close to where the cranking path and the critical load are going to be.
Thank you. Let me go to, we still have 3 more questions. Loving this. So have post-Fukushima station blackout related modifications at nuclear power plants changed how black start timelines are considered for those critical resources? I think we're putting the pressure on you, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'll take a first shot at that. I think one of the good things about the way PJM in particular, but I think the U.S. Nuclear industry probably in general is, in PJM, for instance, is we actually provide black start for nuclear shutdown already. In addition, nuclear units have a requirement to have their own shutdown. So if you think about it, there are potentially more layers of that redundancy in the U.S. Than there may have been during the Fukushima incident, for a lot of different reasons there. But I do think we didn't have to change that because we had already addressed it prior to that. So I think that helps.
Let me add that there's opportunities in the future to have nuclear power plants with more load following capability than they currently have in situations where transmission systems are disrupted and a load is variable. And then looking to the future, Chair Dutrell, of small modular reactors, if that technology becomes commercially viable, then you've got new opportunities above and beyond those we've discussed today to have a nuclear power be part of the solution as opposed to a priority for restoration of grid provided power via black start.
Okay. Another question from Blair. Wouldn't transmission ties be preferable to a black start unit? How much of a challenge is synchronization with IBRs?
Yeah, and I made the comment, I know in my presentation, I'd rather have one tie line to another system, to Duke or TVA, than all the black start units. But having said that, our requirement is really assuming you don't have outside help So plan to be able to do it from inside. You know, hopefully none of us ever sees the day the entire country or interconnection is blacked out, but ties are better. And you know, some of the, I think Gab Sue probably talked about some of the challenges with the inadvertent or inverter based resources. It's promising. I think there's really good research out there, but the coordination is going to be tricky.
Let me also add that high voltage direct current technologies may be able to help provide a greater tie interconnectivity. But Mike's exactly right. You want black start for the worst kinds of days, black sky events, Chair Dutrell, that you've been leading on, where ties may not be available, where you're going to need inverter-based resources, where you're going to need to deal with the challenge that inverter-based resources depend on smart inverters produced largely by China, my friends at SunGrow and Huawei, hardware and software. What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? I'm not going to try to answer that one, but
Well,
Gab Sue is, because he
again,
took his microphone off. There you go.
Time to anticipate that, right? I mean, that's part of the challenge here.
There's no answers wrong here. I mean, we may want to diversify the supporters. I mean, Intertie would be a definite help in some cases, and we see already some, like a demonstration using HVDC as Dr. Stockton already mentioned, like using the power electronics capability, like a soft starting a low power system, slowly ramping up the system, such like that will be helpful. I mean, we may want to have choices, right? And then the worst case, even in the worst case, we may want to restore the grid, so that well that's said. The point.
All right, we still have several questions, but we have 3 minutes. So let me see what I can get to with these questions. I'm going to jump around. Jake says, Mike mentioned FERC 2222. Do the panelists have thoughts on how the value to facilitating black start by DERs and EE can be reflected in market structures and or utility planning?
I'll take a first shot at that, and I'll try to be brief. But I think one of the, and I mentioned this too, I think maybe one of the biggest potentials of DER and storage and microgrids and black start is that idea of, you know, setting up islands. And if you think about that, it supports potentially black start. It supports black sky events as well. Probably not necessarily an integral part of a system restoration, but it allows more sectors of society to be back online or stay online during that. And that may be the biggest role that the DERs have. And I'm gonna have to think about that, how it interplays with the markets a little bit too, but I do think that there are roles, and we address that, I know, in our filing as well.
I guess we are
mute. Sorry about that.
Just to add a tiny point, I think we are at the very beginning of the big changes, like FERC 2222 is just the beginning of like considering or involving the renewable energies into the market. There's a lot of things we can consider, like to truly evaluate the value of the renewable assets in the grid they can play. So yeah, I'm excited to see all those changes coming.
So I think you summed it up very well, because we are coming to the end of our hour. There are so many, we are at the start of so many things in terms of renewable energy and in terms of black start. So I do want to thank all the panelists for joining us today and providing us with so much information. Hopefully we will be able to answer the other questions that we were not able to get to and get an email out to everyone. But I thank you, Naruk, for putting on this panel, and I would turn it back to Will for any final comments.
Yes, Chair. Thank you so much. And thank you to our a great panel. We really enjoyed this discussion. And the active audience participation. To those of you that we didn't get to your questions, I will save the chat and we will try and respond to you by email if possible. Just so that you all are aware, our next innovation webinar will be March 17th. The topic is aligning EV customer charging with grid needs. And you can see our schedule up on this slide deck as well as on our NARA CPI website. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to our next topic in this series. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.